I never thought a bottle of antifreeze would land me in the middle of a legal battle that would expose years of HOA corruption. But here I am, sitting in a courtroom watching my neighbor's face turn the color of a ripe tomato. My name is Quentin Quincy, and I moved to the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona about 3 years ago. The house was perfect, the neighbors seemed friendly enough, and the HOA fees were reasonable compared to other communities in the area. What I didn't know was that the homeowners association was run by a woman named Brenda Patterson, who made it her personal mission to micromanage every single aspect of our lives. Brenda was the textbook definition of a Karen, complete with the asymmetrical blonde bob, the oversized sunglasses that never left the top of her head, and the permanent scowl that suggested everyone around her was personally ruining her day. The whole mess started on a Tuesday morning in January. Arizona winters are mild compared to most of the country, but we still get cold snaps, and that particular week had been unusually chilly with temperatures dropping into the 30s at night. I was in my garage, working on my truck, when I noticed I was running low on coolant. My old Ford F-150 had been leaking a bit. Nothing serious, but I wanted to top it off before the weekend when I planned to drive up to Flagstaff to visit my brother. I had just finished pouring a fresh gallon of antifreeze into my radiator when I heard the clicking of high heels on the concrete driveway. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Brenda had this distinctive walk, purposeful and aggressive, like she was perpetually marching into battle. "Quentin," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I need to speak with you about several violations I've noticed around your property." I wiped my hands on a rag and turned to face her. She was holding her ever-present clipboard, which she wielded like a weapon. Behind her stood 2 other members of the HOA board, Janet Miller and Susan Clark, who always traveled with Brenda like a pack of hyenas. "What violations would those be, Brenda?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She consulted her clipboard with the dramatic flair of a prosecutor presenting damning evidence. "Your trash cans were visible from the street last Thursday evening. The HOA bylaws clearly state that trash receptacles must be stored out of sight except on collection days. Collection is Friday morning, which means you put them out a full day early." "It was Thursday evening," I said. "Collection starts at 6 in the morning on Friday. I put them out at 8 o'clock Thursday night. That's barely 10 hours early." "The rules state collection day, not the night before," she snapped. "That's a $50 fine. Additionally, your grass is approximately 1/4 inch above the maximum allowed height of 3 inches. I looked at my front lawn, which I had mowed just 3 days earlier. "You measured my grass." "I don't need to measure it. I can see it's too long." She made a note on her clipboard. "That's another $50 fine. And I noticed you have a garden hose visible on the side of your house. All hoses must be stored on approved hose reels or inside the garage." "The hose is connected to my outdoor spigot," I said, feeling my jaw clench. "I use it to water my plants. Then you need to install an approved hose reel, another $50. She looked up from her clipboard with a satisfied expression. "That's $150 in total. You'll receive an invoice in the mail." I was about to argue when Janet Miller, a mousy woman in her 50s who seemed to exist solely to agree with Brenda, pointed at my truck. "Is that antifreeze?" I glanced at the bright green bottle sitting on my workbench. "Yeah, I was just topping off my radiator." Brenda's eyes lit up like she'd just discovered buried treasure. "Is that a full gallon?" It was full. I used about half of it. "I need that," Brenda said, not asked, just stated it as a fact. I stared at her. "Excuse me." "My car has been running hot, and I need antifreeze." I'm demanding that you share that bottle with me as part of your community responsibility as outlined in Section 12 of the HOA Covenant. I had read the HOA Covenant front to back when I bought the house, and I was pretty sure there was no section requiring residents to share their personal property. Section 12 is about shared community amenities like the pool and the clubhouse. It doesn't say anything about sharing antifreeze. Section 12, subsection D states that all residents must contribute to the welfare and maintenance of the community. Your refusal to help a fellow homeowner in need violates that principle. She held out her hand. The antifreeze, please. Brenda, this is ridiculous. If you need coolant, you can buy it at any auto parts store. There's an auto zone 5 minutes from here. I don't have time to go to the store. I have an important meeting in Phoenix in 2 hours and my car is overheating. As the HOA president, I'm authorized to requisition necessary items from residents in emergency situations. That's not a real thing, I said. And overheating is a serious problem. If your car is actually overheating, you shouldn't drive it at all. You could damage your engine. Susan Clark, the third member of Brenda's entourage, chimed in with her nasal voice. Are you refusing to help Brenda? That sounds like a violation of community standards. We could fine you for creating a hostile environment. I looked at the three of them standing in my driveway, and something inside me snapped. I was tired of the constant harassment, the made-up violations, the arbitrary fines. Every week it was something new. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My porch light was too bright. I had the audacity to park my own truck in my own driveway instead of the garage. I was done playing their game. Fine, I said. Let me get you something for your radiator. Brenda looked surprised that I'd given in so easily, but she nodded approvingly. That's more like it. Community cooperation is what makes Meadowbrook Heights such a desirable place to live. I went into my garage and grabbed an empty antifreeze bottle I'd been saving for recycling. I took it to my utility sink, rinsed it out thoroughly, and filled it with plain tap water. The bottle was opaque green, so you couldn't see the contents unless you poured it out. I put the cap back on and walked back to where Brenda was waiting. Here you go, I said, handing her the bottle. This should help with your overheating problem. She took it without thanking me, examined the bottle for a moment, then tucked it under her arm. See how easy that was. If everyone in the community was as cooperative as you're being right now, we wouldn't need to issue so many fines. Of course, you still owe $150 for the violations I mentioned earlier. I'll look forward to that invoice, I said dryly. The three of them left, and I watched as Brenda got into her silver Mercedes sedan, opened her hood, and poured the entire bottle of water into her radiator. She slammed the hood shut, got in the car, and drove off. Janet and Susan followed in their own vehicles. I went back to working on my truck, feeling a small twinge of guilt. I knew that putting plain water in a radiator wasn't good for a car, especially in winter. But I rationalized it by telling myself that she was going to damage her engine anyway by driving while overheating. Water would at least cool the engine temporarily and prevent it from seizing up on the way to her meeting. If she'd gone to a mechanic like a reasonable person, they would have diagnosed the actual problem instead of just adding coolant. 3 days later, I got a knock on my door at 7 in the morning. I opened it to find Brenda standing there, and she looked absolutely furious. Her face was blotchy and red, and her hands were shaking. "You did this on purpose," she hissed. "You sabotaged my car. What are you talking about?" My radiator cracked open on the highway, completely destroyed. The mechanic said someone filled it with water instead of antifreeze, and when the temperature dropped that night, the water froze and expanded, cracking the radiator housing. It cost me $1,800 to replace. I kept my expression neutral. That's terrible. Did you add something to your radiator recently? You know I did. You gave me that bottle of antifreeze, except it wasn't antifreeze at all. It was water. You deliberately gave me water knowing it would damage my car. I gave you a bottle to help with your overheating problem, I said carefully. You demanded it, actually. You said it was an emergency and that you were authorized to requisition items from residents. You knew it was water. Brenda, I gave you what you asked for. If there was a problem with it, maybe you should have checked what you were putting in your car instead of just assuming. Or better yet, maybe you should have taken your car to a mechanic instead of strong-arming your neighbors into giving you their property. This is criminal, she sputtered. This is vandalism, property damage. I'm calling the police. Go ahead, I said. While you're at it, you can explain to them how you demanded my personal property and how you threatened me with HOA fines if I didn't comply. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that. She pointed a shaking finger at me. You're going to pay for this. I'm going to make your life a living hell. By the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never moved to Meadowbrook Heights. She stormed off, and I closed the door, my heart pounding. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I also wasn't going to let her bully me into admitting guilt. She had demanded my property, and I'd given her something. What she chose to do with it was her responsibility. Over the next week, the harassment ramped up to levels I didn't think were possible. I received violation notices every single day. My doormat was the wrong color. My potted plants on the front porch violated the approved plant list. My porch furniture was made of the wrong material. Each violation came with a $50 to $100 fine. Within 7 days, I had accumulated over $2,000 in fines. I started documenting everything. I took photos of my property, printed out copies of the HOA bylaws, and highlighted every single rule they claimed I was violating. In most cases, the rules they cited either didn't exist or were being wildly misinterpreted. I also noticed that none of my neighbors were receiving similar violations, even though many of them had the same items or conditions on their properties. The breaking point came when I received a notice that the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines. According to the letter, if I didn't pay the accumulated fines of $3,200 within 30 days, they would begin foreclosure proceedings. I had never paid a single one of the fines because I believed they were all fraudulent, but I hadn't expected them to escalate this quickly. I contacted a real estate attorney named Thomas Pritchard, who specialized in HOA disputes. He had good reviews online and had successfully represented several homeowners in similar situations. His office was in downtown Scottsdale, in a modern glass building that looked expensive. Thomas was in his late 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to my story, examined all my documentation, and then leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "This is textbook HOA abuse," he said. "Selective enforcement, retaliatory fining, improper lien filing. The good news is you have an excellent case. The bad news is that fighting an HOA can be expensive and time-consuming." "How expensive?" "It depends on how far they want to take this. If we can resolve it with a strongly worded letter and negotiation, maybe $5,000. If it goes to court, we could be looking at $20,000 to $30,000, possibly more." I felt sick. So either I pay their fraudulent fines or I pay even more to fight them. Unfortunately, that's the calculation many homeowners face, which is why so many HOAs get away with this behavior. They know most people can't afford to fight back. He paused. "However, there's something else here that interests me. You said the HOA president demanded your property and threatened you with fines if you didn't comply. That's right. And then, when her car was damaged, she blamed you and increased the harassment. Yes. Thomas made some notes on his legal pad. That could potentially be extortion, using her position in the HOA to obtain property through threats, then retaliating when the outcome wasn't what she wanted. If we can establish a pattern of this behavior, we might be able to go beyond just fighting the fines. We might be able to challenge the HOA's management entirely. What does that mean? It means we investigate whether the HOA board has been abusing their authority in other ways. Misappropriation of funds, selective enforcement, harassment of other residents. If we can show systematic corruption, we can petition to have the board removed and potentially pursue criminal charges. I thought about the past 3 years of living under Brenda's rule. The constant fines, the arbitrary enforcement of rules, the way she seemed to target certain residents while ignoring violations by her friends. How do we do that? We start by talking to your neighbors. Find out if anyone else has been targeted. Get their stories, their documentation. Build a pattern of abuse. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly reached out to other residents in Meadowbrook Heights. I was careful about it, not wanting Brenda to catch wind of what I was doing. I started with my immediate neighbors, then expanded to people I'd met at community events or seen at the pool. What I discovered shocked me. Nearly everyone had a horror story about the HOA. My neighbor to the left, an elderly man named Robert Chen, had been fined repeatedly for his unkempt yard, even though his lawn was immaculate. The fines had gotten so bad that he'd seriously considered selling his house and moving, despite having lived there for 15 years. A young couple 3 houses down, Mark and Lisa Torres, had been denied permission to paint their front door, even though the color they wanted was on the approved list. When they painted it anyway, they were fined $500 and ordered to repaint it to the original color. They later discovered that Brenda's friend, 2 streets over, had painted her door the exact same color and had never been cited for any violation. A single mother named Patricia Williams told me she'd been cited for having a commercial vehicle in her driveway. The vehicle in question was a Honda Accord with a small magnetic sign on the door advertising her house-cleaning business. When she removed the sign, she was told the car was still considered commercial because everyone knew what she used it for. She'd been paying $50 fines every week for 8 months. The stories kept coming. A retired veteran who'd been cited for displaying an American flag that was too large. A teacher who'd been fined for parking her car in her own driveway during school hours because it gave the appearance that someone was home during the day, which was inappropriate. A family that had been denied permission to install a wheelchair ramp for their disabled son because it didn't match the architectural aesthetic of the community. I brought all of this information back to Thomas, along with documentation from 17 different homeowners who were willing to testify about HOA abuse. Thomas reviewed everything with increasing interest, and by the end of our meeting, he was actually excited. "This is bigger than I thought," he said. "We're not just looking at harassment and selective enforcement. We're potentially looking at fraud, embezzlement, and violations of fair housing laws. That wheelchair ramp denial could be an ADA violation, which is federal. So what's our next step? We file a lawsuit, not just for your fines, but a class action on behalf of all affected homeowners. We sue the HOA, the management company they hired, and the individual board members personally for abuse of authority. And we contact the Arizona Attorney General's office because if there's financial fraud involved, they'll want to investigate." The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later. Brenda and the HOA board were served with papers on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook. The calls went to voicemail. Brenda left 7 messages, each one more unhinged than the last. The first was coldly professional, informing me that the lawsuit was frivolous and would be dismissed. By the 7th message, she was screaming about how I was destroying the community and how I would regret ever crossing her. The HOA held an emergency meeting that Thursday night. It was supposed to be for board members only, but Thomas advised me to show up anyway since it was technically a special session, which under Arizona law had to be open to all homeowners. I arrived to find the clubhouse packed with residents, far more than usually attended HOA meetings. Brenda stood at the front of the room, flanked by Janet and Susan, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smudged, and she had dark circles under her eyes. "This meeting is for board members only," she announced when she saw me. Actually, under Arizona Revised Statutes Title 33, Chapter 16, all HOA meetings except executive sessions must be open to homeowners, I said calmly. "Unless you're discussing pending litigation or personnel matters, this meeting is public." Thomas had coached me well. Brenda's face turned red, but she couldn't argue with state law. "Fine. Sit down and keep quiet." The meeting was a disaster for Brenda. She tried to frame the lawsuit as a personal attack by a disgruntled homeowner who was upset about legitimate violations. But when she opened the floor to comments, resident after resident stood up to share their own stories of HOA abuse. People I'd never talked to, people I didn't even know were having problems. A man named David Kim revealed that he'd been paying inflated fines for 2 years after his satellite dish was deemed too visible, even though it was mounted on his roof exactly as specified in the HOA guidelines. He'd paid over $4,000 in accumulated fines and late fees. A woman named Rachel Martinez talked about how she'd been denied permission to run a home-based business, even though she was a freelance graphic designer who never had clients visit her house. Meanwhile, Brenda's friend operated a home daycare that had cars coming and going all day, and that was apparently fine. The most damning testimony came from a man named Harold Jennings, who had been the HOA treasurer until 6 months ago. He'd resigned from the board after what he called fundamental disagreements about financial management. Now, standing in front of the entire community, he dropped a bombshell. "I resigned because Brenda was using HOA funds for personal expenses," Harold said. His voice shook, but he kept going. "She submitted reimbursement requests for meals, shopping trips, even a weekend spa retreat, all of which she claimed were HOA-related expenses. When I questioned these expenses and refused to approve them, she called for a vote to remove me as treasurer. I resigned before they could remove me, but I kept copies of all the financial records." The room erupted. Homeowners were shouting questions, demanding answers. Brenda tried to regain control, insisting that all expenses had been legitimate business costs, but no one was listening anymore. Janet and Susan, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly started distancing themselves from Brenda, claiming they hadn't known about any financial irregularities. The meeting ended in chaos. Thomas stood up and announced that anyone who wanted to join the class action lawsuit could contact his office. Over 30 people approached him before we even left the clubhouse. The next morning, I filed a police report about Brenda's demand for my antifreeze and her subsequent retaliation. I provided the responding officer with a detailed timeline, copies of all the violation notices I'd received, and testimonies from neighbors who'd witnessed the escalating harassment. The officer, A young woman named Detective Sarah Walsh listened carefully and took extensive notes. What she did, demanding your property and threatening you with fines, that could potentially be coercion or extortion, Detective Walsh said. The retaliation afterward strengthens that case. I'm going to pass this along to our fraud division because it sounds like there might be a larger pattern of financial crimes here. That's what our attorney thinks too, I said. We have a former HOA treasurer willing to testify about misappropriation of funds. We'll want to talk to him. Can you provide contact information? I gave her Harold Jennings' phone number and email. Detective Walsh assured me they would investigate thoroughly, though she cautioned that white-collar crime cases could take time to build. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, Detective Walsh and a financial crimes investigator obtained a warrant for the HOA's financial records. Thomas, representing the homeowners in the class action suit, also subpoenaed the records as part of the discovery process. What they found was staggering. Brenda had been systematically looting the HOA for 3 years since she became president. The spending started small, a dinner here, a tank of gas there, all submitted as legitimate expenses. But it escalated quickly. She'd charged the HOA for a complete kitchen renovation at her house, claiming it was for the Community Entertainment Center, even though no community events were ever held at her home. She'd bought a 65-inch television and a sound system, supposedly for the clubhouse, but they'd never been installed there. She'd submitted reimbursement for community landscaping supplies, and then used the plants and materials in her own yard. In total, Brenda had embezzled over $87,000 from the HOA over 3 years. Some of it was direct reimbursement fraud, but a significant amount came from inflated contracts with vendors who were kicking back a portion of their fees to her. The landscaping company that maintained the common areas was owned by her brother-in-law. The pool maintenance company was overcharging by 30% and giving Brenda cash payments. Even the management company that handled the HOA's day-to-day operations was in on it, falsifying records in exchange for their contract being renewed without competitive bidding. Janet Miller and Susan Clark were also implicated, though to a lesser degree. They'd each received a few $1,000s in fraudulent reimbursements and had actively helped cover up Brenda's more extensive theft. The investigation revealed that they'd approved obviously fraudulent expenses and had voted to reject any financial audits proposed by other board members. The Arizona Attorney General's office got involved after Detective Walsh presented her findings. They expanded the investigation to include not just Brenda, but the entire network of vendors and the management company. It turned out that this wasn't an isolated case. The management company, called Premier Community Services, had been facilitating similar fraud in at least 8 other HOAs across the Phoenix metro area. Brenda was arrested on a Thursday morning in late March. I wasn't there, but several neighbors were, and word spread quickly through the community. She was charged with theft, fraud, forgery, and misuse of fiduciary position. The theft alone was a Class 2 felony because the amount exceeded $25,000. She was looking at potential prison time of 3 to 12 years if convicted. Janet and Susan were arrested the same day on lesser charges. The management company's executives were arrested a week later. Brenda's brother-in-law, the landscaping contractor, was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. The whole corrupt network was falling apart. The class action lawsuit moved forward in parallel with the criminal cases. Thomas filed motions to invalidate all the fines that had been issued during Brenda's tenure as president, arguing that they were part of a pattern of harassment and illegal retaliation. He also sought compensation for homeowners who had paid fraudulent fines, plus damages for emotional distress and the diminished property values that resulted from the HOA's mismanagement. The HOA's insurance company initially tried to deny coverage, claiming that intentional criminal acts weren't covered under the policy. Thomas argued that the HOA as an entity was liable regardless of whether the individual board members' actions were covered by insurance. Eventually, the insurance company agreed to settle for $1.2 million, which would be distributed among the affected homeowners. My share of the settlement was $43,000. It included reimbursement for all the fraudulent fines I'd been charged, compensation for the stress and harassment, and my portion of the legal fees. More importantly, every fraudulent fine issued during Brenda's tenure was formally voided, and the lien on my property was removed. The criminal trial for Brenda Patterson began in September. I was called as a witness to testify about the antifreeze incident and the subsequent retaliation. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Foster, walked me through the timeline of events. "Mr. Quincy, can you describe what happened on January 10th when the defendant came to your home?" she asked. I recounted the entire encounter, how Brenda had first hit me with bogus violations, then demanded my antifreeze, then threatened me with more fines if I didn't comply. I explained how I'd given her water instead, and how she'd subsequently retaliated with an avalanche of new violations. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Richard Moss, tried to paint me as vindictive. "Mr. Quincy, you deliberately gave Miss Patterson water instead of antifreeze, knowing it would damage her vehicle, correct?" "I gave her what she asked for to stop her from threatening me with more fines," I said. "She demanded my property. She said it was an emergency. Water is better than nothing when a car is overheating." "But you knew water could freeze and crack the radiator." "I knew that driving an overheating car could seize the engine and cause thousands in damage. I also knew that any reasonable person would have their car diagnosed by a mechanic instead of extorting automotive fluids from their neighbors." The judge sustained an objection before the defense attorney could respond, but my point was made. The antifreeze incident wasn't the focus of the criminal trial anyway. It was just one example of a pattern of behavior that included extortion, harassment, and abuse of authority. The financial crimes were the heart of the prosecution's case. They had bank records, receipts, contracts, and testimony from Harold Jennings and other former board members. They had the vendors who'd participated in the kickback schemes, several of whom had taken plea deals in exchange for testifying against Brenda. They had homeowners who'd been fined into near bankruptcy for violations that didn't exist. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. They found Brenda Patterson guilty on all counts: theft, fraud, forgery, and misuse of fiduciary position. Janet Miller and Susan Clark had taken plea deals earlier, agreeing to testify against Brenda in exchange for reduced charges. They each received 2 years of supervised probation and were ordered to pay restitution. Brenda's sentencing hearing was in November. The judge, a stern older woman named Marilyn Torres, listened to impact statements from multiple homeowners. Robert Chen, the elderly man who'd been targeted for his unkempt yard, talked about the stress of thinking he'd have to sell his home. Patricia Williams, the single mother, described the financial strain of paying weekly fines on top of raising 3 kids alone. Mark and Lisa Torres explained how they'd delayed having a second child because they couldn't afford it after paying thousands in fraudulent HOA fines. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. Brenda Patterson used her position to bully, harass, and steal from people who trusted her to manage their community. She turned what should have been a pleasant neighborhood into a source of constant anxiety. She needs to be held accountable not just for the money she stole, but for the abuse of power that affected dozens of families. Judge Torres sentenced Brenda to 7 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $87,000 to the HOA, plus additional damages to individual homeowners. Her Mercedes, which she'd partially purchased with stolen HOA funds, was seized as proceeds of crime. The management company, Premier Community Services, lost its license to operate in Arizona and was hit with massive fines. The company went bankrupt, and its executives faced their own criminal trials. The ripple effects extended to other HOAs they'd managed, triggering audits and investigations that uncovered more fraud. Meadowbrook Heights had to rebuild its HOA from scratch. A new board was elected, and this time homeowners were paying attention. We implemented strict financial controls, requiring monthly transparent accounting reports and annual independent audits. We revised the bylaws to limit the board's authority to issue fines, and created an appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been unfairly cited. Most importantly, we established term limits to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. The new HOA president was Harold Jennings, the former treasurer who'd blown the whistle on Brenda's fraud. He was reluctant at first, but enough people urged him to run that he eventually agreed. His first act as president was to apologize on behalf of the HOA to everyone who'd been victimized by the previous board. Life in Meadowbrook Heights slowly returned to normal, or at least a better version of normal than we'd had under Brenda's rule. The constant anxiety about violation notices disappeared. People started actually enjoying their homes instead of living in fear of the HOA. Property values, which had been stagnant during the years of mismanagement, began to rise again. I still think about that morning in my garage when Brenda demanded my antifreeze. I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times, wondering if I should have handled it differently. Maybe I should have just refused outright, or maybe I should have given her the real antifreeze. But then I think about everything that happened afterward, how that one incident led to exposing years of corruption and abuse. And I realize that sometimes the universe has a strange way of bringing justice. The irony isn't lost on me that a bottle of water, something so simple and harmless, ended up being the catalyst that brought down an entire criminal enterprise. If I'd given Brenda the real antifreeze, her radiator wouldn't have cracked. She wouldn't have come to my house in a rage, threatening me. I wouldn't have started fighting back, wouldn't have connected with other homeowners, wouldn't have hired Thomas and started the investigation that unraveled everything. A cracked radiator cost her $1,800 to fix, but it ended up costing her 7 years of freedom and her entire reputation. Was it worth it? For her, obviously not. For the rest of us in Meadowbrook Heights, absolutely. We got our community back. I still see some of the people who went through this with me. Robert Chen waves when I drive by his house, which now has a beautiful garden that he maintains without fear of arbitrary fines. Patricia Williams' cleaning business has expanded, and she drives around with her magnetic signs displayed proudly. Mark and Lisa Torres painted their front door that color they originally wanted, and nobody said a word about it. They also had their second child, a baby girl they named Justice, which I thought was perfect. The wheelchair ramp that had been denied was finally installed, and the HOA not only approved it, but issued a formal apology to the family and paid for half the construction costs as restitution. The retired veteran flies his American flag at whatever size he wants. People park in their driveways, display their doormats, and live their lives without constantly looking over their shoulders. Thomas Pritchard sent me a Christmas card last year with a note saying that our case had become something of a legend in HOA law circles. He'd received calls from homeowners all over the country facing similar situations, and he'd used the precedents from our case to help them fight back. He said we'd struck a blow against HOA tyranny that would have ripple effects for years to come. As for me, I fixed the leak in my truck's radiator, and I keep a well-stocked shelf of automotive supplies in my garage. I have antifreeze, oil, brake fluid, transmission fluid, all of it properly labeled and stored. And if anyone ever asks to borrow something, I'm happy to share, as long as they ask nicely instead of demanding it while threatening me with fines. I learned a lot through this experience. I learned that standing up to bullies is hard and expensive and stressful, but sometimes it's necessary. I learned that corruption thrives in the shadows and that sunshine is the best disinfectant. I learned that communities are stronger when people communicate with each other instead of living in isolation. And I learned that sometimes the smallest act of resistance can lead to the biggest changes. The bottle of water I gave Brenda that January morning wasn't about revenge, at least not consciously. It was about refusing to be bullied, about drawing a line and saying this far and no further. I didn't know it would lead to investigations and arrests and trials and prison sentences. I just knew I was tired of being pushed around in my own home, in the community I paid to be part of. Looking back now, 2 years after everything started, I can see how each small decision led to the next, how the chain of events unfolded in ways I never could have predicted. If I'd paid those first fines, would I have ended up paying thousands more? Would Brenda still be in power, still stealing from the HOA, still making everyone's lives miserable? Would other homeowners have found the courage to speak up, or would they have continued suffering in silence? I don't have answers to those hypothetical questions, but I'm glad I don't have to. The reality we live in now is so much better than the reality we left behind. Meadowbrook Heights is actually a nice place to live now. The HOA does what it's supposed to do, maintaining common areas and organizing community events, without the oppressive enforcement of petty rules. We have barbecues at the pool in summer, and nobody gets fined for bringing the wrong type of cooler. We have holiday decorating contests, and nobody gets cited for having lights that are too bright or not bright enough. Harold Jennings has been an excellent HOA president. He's transparent about finances, publishes detailed reports every month, and actually listens to homeowners instead of dictating to them. Under his leadership, we've made real improvements to the community, repaving roads that needed it, upgrading the playground equipment, even installing solar panels on the clubhouse to reduce energy costs. These improvements are paid for with HOA funds that aren't being embezzled, and everyone can see exactly where their money is going. The new board meets once a month, and the meetings are well attended because people actually want to be involved now instead of avoiding the HOA out of fear. We vote on important decisions, we debate bylaws changes, we work together to make the community better. It's what an HOA is supposed to be, neighbors cooperating for the common good instead of a power-hungry tyrant using her position to enrich herself and settle personal grudges. I still have the original bottle of antifreeze from that day, the one I didn't give to Brenda. It's sitting on my garage shelf, almost empty now because I've used it for its intended purpose over the past 2 years. Every time I see it, I'm reminded of how something so ordinary became the center of something so extraordinary. Detective Walsh told me later that the antifreeze incident was actually crucial to the criminal case. It established mens rea, criminal intent, because it showed Brenda's willingness to abuse her authority for personal benefit and then retaliate when things didn't go her way. It was a clear, documented example of the mindset that allowed her to commit the larger fraud. One incident, witnessed by multiple people, with a clear timeline and obvious motive, helped prove the pattern of behavior that made the bigger crimes possible. The civil case settlement money helped a lot of people. Some used it to pay off debts they'd accumulated paying fraudulent fines. Some put it toward home improvements they'd been delaying. Some donated portions to local charities. I used mine to set up a legal fund for the HOA, a reserve account specifically designated to help homeowners who need to challenge unfair treatment. It's something Harold suggested, and the new board unanimously approved. If anyone ever faces the kind of harassment I dealt with, they'll have resources to fight back without having to drain their savings. We also established an HOA ombudsman position, a neutral third party that homeowners can contact if they feel they're being unfairly targeted. The ombudsman reviews complaints, investigates whether rules are being applied consistently, and can recommend disciplinary action against board members who abuse their authority. It's an additional check on power, a safeguard against anyone trying to turn the HOA into their personal fiefdom again. The changes we made have attracted attention from other communities. We've had HOA boards from other subdivisions reach out to learn about our reforms and ask how they can implement similar systems. Harold has given presentations at community management conferences, talking about transparency and accountability in HOA governance. Our story has been covered in local news, in HOA management publications, even in a national consumer protection magazine. We've become an example of how homeowners can take back control when their HOA goes wrong. Not everything has been perfect. There were legal complications that dragged on for months. There were homeowners who didn't want to get involved, who just wanted to keep their heads down even after Brenda was gone. There were expenses and stress and moments when I wondered if it was worth the fight. But every time I doubted, I talked to someone like Robert Chen or Patricia Williams, someone whose life had been genuinely improved by what we did, and I'd remember why it mattered. My brother in Flagstaff still laughs about the whole thing when I visit him. He calls me the Antifreeze Avenger, which I guess is better than some of the things Brenda called me during her 7 voicemails. He was supportive throughout the whole ordeal, let me vent when I needed to, gave me advice when I asked for it. He's a teacher, not a lawyer, but he has good instincts about people, and he was the one who first suggested I document everything Brenda was doing. That documentation became crucial evidence in both the civil and criminal cases. My parents, who live in Tucson, were worried at first. They thought I should just pay the fines and avoid confrontation. They grew up in an era where you didn't make waves, you didn't challenge authority, you just went along to get along. But as the investigation uncovered more and more of Brenda's crimes, they came around. My dad even said he was proud of me for standing up for what was right, which meant a lot coming from him. The experience changed me in ways I didn't expect. I'm more involved in local politics now, paying attention to city council meetings and school board decisions. I learned that corruption doesn't just happen at high levels of government. It happens in small communities too, and the only way to fight it is through transparency and accountability. I learned that ordinary people can make a difference if they're willing to document, organize, and persevere. I also learned to trust my instincts. When Brenda first started harassing me, Part of me wondered if maybe I was being too sensitive, if maybe the violations were legitimate and I just didn't want to follow the rules. But my instincts told me something was wrong, that the enforcement was arbitrary and vindictive. Trusting those instincts and investigating further led to uncovering the truth. If I'd ignored them and just paid the fines, the abuse would have continued, maybe for years. The other homeowners who were part of the class action suit have become friends. We have a group chat where we share news and jokes and support each other. We meet up for dinner occasionally, talking about everything except the HOA drama, though inevitably someone brings up a memory or a detail we'd forgotten, and we all end up laughing or shaking our heads. We went through something together, something difficult and stressful, and we came out the other side. That creates a bond that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. Sometimes I wonder what Brenda thinks about in prison. Does she have regrets? Does she understand how her actions hurt people? Or does she still see herself as the victim, unfairly persecuted for trying to maintain community standards? I'll never know, and honestly, I don't need to. Her thoughts and feelings aren't my responsibility. My responsibility was to protect myself and my community, and I did that. The legal system worked eventually. It wasn't fast and it wasn't easy, but it worked. Crimes were investigated, evidence was gathered, trials were held, and justice was served. The civil courts provided compensation for damages. The criminal courts provided accountability and consequences. The system has flaws, plenty of them, but in this case it functioned the way it's supposed to. I still live in Meadowbrook Heights, and I plan to stay here. This is my home, and I'm not going to let anyone drive me away from it. The community is better now than it was when I first moved here, better than it ever was under Brenda's rule. We proved that change is possible, that standing up to corruption can work, that ordinary people have power if they're willing to use it. The irony of the whole situation still makes me laugh sometimes. Brenda was so obsessed with controlling everyone and everything that she couldn't imagine anyone would challenge her. She demanded my antifreeze with complete confidence that I'd comply, just like everyone always had before. And when I gave her water instead, when I refused to be another victim of her bullying, it set in motion a chain of events that destroyed everything she'd built. A bottle of water brought down an empire of petty tyranny. $1,800 in car repairs led to the exposure of $87,000 in theft. One homeowner refusing to back down inspired dozens of others to come forward. And a small HOA in Scottsdale, Arizona, became a case study in how to fight back against corruption and win. I keep that empty antifreeze bottle on my shelf not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that small actions have consequences, that standing up matters, that corruption thrives when good people stay silent. It's a reminder that I have more power than I sometimes think I do, and that using that power responsibly can make a real difference. Every morning when I back my truck out of my garage, I see that bottle on the shelf. And every morning it reminds me that I live in a community where I don't have to be afraid of my HOA anymore, where my neighbors and I work together instead of living in fear, where justice eventually prevailed over corruption. That's worth more than any amount of money, worth more than avoiding conflict, worth more than taking the easy path of compliance. Brenda Patterson demanded I share my antifreeze. I gave her water instead. Her radiator cracked open, and in the end, so did her entire criminal operation. Sometimes the smallest act of defiance leads to the greatest victories. Sometimes saying no to a bully changes everything. And sometimes a bottle of water is exactly what someone deserves.